Danielle Ofri, the chief editor of the BLR, and tonight's presentation is co-presented with the BLR and the Gold Foundation. I want to welcome my co-editor, Damon Tweedy, who is the new nonfiction editor of the BLR. Welcome, Damon.
Hey, hello. Nice to be here.
We're going to introduce four of our incredible guests. You'll get to hear a little bit about how they came to be a writer and what sort of writing they're doing now, and they'll share a little bit of our work. So let me first bring everyone in here. And Damon, I'll hand it to you.
Okay, we're going to start with Michele Harper. So Michele Harper, MD, is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Beauty in Breaking, which earned a spot on the Times 100 Notable Books of 2020 list. She is an emergency medicine physician who's worked at Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx and the VA in Philadelphia.
Ofole Mgbako is currently an infectious disease fellow at Columbia, specifically focused on HIV care and research among LGBTQ patients and patients of color. His writing focuses on his experience as a gay Black physician, on the patient-provider relationship, and on racism and homophobia in medicine. Welcome, Ofole.
Okay, so next we have Esther Choo. It's good to see her again. So she's an emergency physician and professor at the Oregon Health and Science University. She is a popular science communicator who has used social media to talk about racism and sexism in healthcare. It's really good to see you again.
And then I want to introduce Kevin Gutierrez, who is a graduate of the Narrative Medicine program at Columbia University, where he taught courses on critical race and decolonial theory. He's a first-year resident psychiatry at NYU and teaches on topics of medicine, chattel slavery, and critical theory. Welcome, Kevin.
Yeah, so it's a pleasure just to sort of see everyone here. I've seen your works in different forums and venues, and it's funny because looking back, I sort of feel a little bit old, honestly, just sort of seeing. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about sort of kind of where we are, because it's discussions about race and writing and medicine, and I want to just frame a little bit, kind of give you a sense of where we've come from and sort of where we are now and sort of moving forward. I finished residency in 2007 in psychiatry. And it was at that point that I started being interested in really writing about these experiences that I had at race in medicine. And I want to tell you what happened. So I started off trying to write in like medical journals, starting writing sort of short narrative pieces. And this is one of the things that really stuck with me. And I wrote it down here. It's a quote: "We publish viewpoints on issues of importance to academic medicine's leaders." So that was their swipe saying that this whole issue was not important. This is a very leading prestigious medical journal. I won't say which ones, but it's a couple different ones. But then they said further, quote, "Besides, much of what you write about is not really new." So they're saying is that, we know this is a problem, but in some ways we just don't care. I mean, and that's basically the way I interpret it. I'm not taking it as a personal affront. I mean, it's not about, because my writing probably wasn't very good at the time at all, but it's just more about the idea that they thought the topic itself had no merit. And so that's just something to think about. And for me, one other thing I'll say is that when it came to writing books in 2015, so around 2013, I started writing it, and I got the same response from the publishing community. They said, "Race in medicine, is that a thing? Really? Like, I don't think there's a book there." And so these are the kind of responses. So I just sort of think about, from a historical lens, where we are. And of course, now things have changed to some degree. And so I'd like to open it up and talking, ask Michele, kind of tell us a little bit about sort of your, writing journey. How did you sort of get into these issues and get this lens? And so just tell us a little bit about that, how it kind of got started.
I will, and I will tell you that I met resistance as well. And I was recently on this podcast where it took me a while to get an agent, and an agent I heard from, she responded like 6 months later, just to let me know we didn't need my voice. And then went out of her way, listed different, like, majority race men, like one I'd never even heard of. I had to Google him because I was like, who's this guy? And that was the whole purpose of her letter. But I persisted because it's important to do so. Mm-hmm. And the reason for me is I feel that in medicine, I mean, we're all in medicine, we know this, we can help one person at a time, one family, maybe one community. But with writing, that crosses all boundaries, state, internationally. So I feel like that is the chance to amplify the stories and work for justice on a much larger scale. Because facts, we can tell people facts all day long, but we're human beings and we're moved by emotion. What finally changed people when it came to being willing to look at policing, the video, the murder of George Floyd, right? So when I write about when the police wanted me to force an illegal exam on a Black man in custody, and I tell the story about how I stood up to them and how my trainee, my white female resident, wanted to override my order and invoke a higher authority, who then hospital administration, legal, told her I was actually right. And so when I bring people into the room, yeah, they kind of knew it. I would even hear from people, yeah, we knew it, but we didn't know it. And when you wrote about it, we feel it in a different way. And so in that way, I feel that it potentially inspires action. And also those of us who are doing this work, it supports them in our work, because it's often really lonely working for justice.
That's really beautiful. And I think the idea that writing tells a story in a way that citing facts does not, I think it is what moves people. And maybe you could read a little bit from your new book for us.
Oh, yes. So we have like a couple minutes to read. I'm going to read from the introduction since it doesn't require any context. Okay. So starting on the first page, as I cradled my patient's head in my hands, I looked past the watery wells of his eyes. For a moment, I didn't notice the blood that ran in rivulets across my gloves as it poured from his scalp, or the bits of gray and white brain matter that dotted the sheets. The beeping of the monitors around me, the popping sound of IV catheter tops being flicked off by the nurses, the screeching of wheels as equipment was dragged across linoleum floors, the nurses and techs yelling directions at one another, the stifled gasps erupting from the 2 medical students on their first ER shift, attempting in vain not to be startled. All were drowned out as I stood over this young man and tried to ease his agitation. This is the part of being a doctor that medical school doesn't cover, that case reviews don't prepare you for. This is the part you can't really know until you're in the moment. You are the person responsible for saving the human life that slowly slips through your fingers while silently begging for final redemption under the demanding fluorescent lights. I am the doctor whose palms bolster the head of the 20-year-old man with a gunshot wound to his brain. I support the baby as she takes her first breath outside her mother's womb. I hug the wife whose husband is dying from advanced liver disease as she implores the universe to take away his pain. I claim no special powers, nor do I know how to handle death any better than you. What I know is that for 36 hours a week, I reside in the melee that is a hospital emergency room, where I'm called upon to be salve, antidote, and sometimes Charon. Most of the time, my job is to keep death at bay. When I am successful, I send the patient back out into the world. When I'm not, I am there as life passes away. I'm not so deluded as to think that I alone am capable of making that kind of difference. I'm well aware that the determination of who lives and who dies doesn't happen at my hands alone. There are times when, despite the designs of any patient, family member, friend, or doctor, death will come. Then I am witness. What I can do is be the fairy woman who holds the body as the last breath escapes, the one who, like the night sentinel, calls out the hour and does her best to convey that all is well.
Wow. Thank you. That was really, really beautiful. Thank you.
You know, just as I was listening, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say I could almost visualize the scene. Like I was watching a movie or a TV show and seeing that scene of you unfolding. So that's a very good visual sort of. I could just sort of see you in that space in that moment. So I just wanted to. I'm sorry.
That is wonderful. Thanks. Ofole, I'm going to turn to you. I'll say our former chief resident at Bellevue and NYU, who's now off to bigger and better, larger fields. Tell us a bit how you sort of came to writing and what areas of writing attract you.
Yeah, most definitely. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you all. Michele, those were really beautiful words. Thank you for sharing them to get us started. So when I was thinking about going into medicine, it was after I had the opportunity and the privilege to study history and literature as an undergraduate. and I focused on Africa and America. And while I was kind of trying to bring together this, this program for myself, I was told what many of us have heard is that our people don't write, or they didn't write in the past, and that there's not a canon of literature for us to go into in terms of history. But I spent those years reading Wole Soyinka and Chinua Achebe and Langston Hughes and James Baldwin, and really realizing that writing and resistance go hand in hand. And so when I decided to go into medicine, I really didn't see a difference in terms of the healthcare establishment or the healthcare field as one of these institutions where there has been historical violence or there has been racism that we still need to confront. And in a lot of ways have used those lessons and those words from revolutionary thinkers and writers who confronted racism, who grappled with the meaning of Blackness, and landed on the creation of a culture that I just feel such privilege in terms of being a part of and being the inheritor of. That, writing to me feels like a continuation of their legacy, honoring their legacy. And doing that as a physician too is really important to me. One of the kind of movements I focused on when I was studying kind of this comparative history and literature was Stephen Biko's Black consciousness movement in South Africa. And one of the things I learned when I first started reading Steve Biko's works is that he was in medical school when he thought of the Black consciousness movement. And he thought about, how do I dismantle apartheid? How do I build a movement that's multiracial, multicultural, but under the banner of Blackness, that's all about pride and all about a better future for not just his people in South Africa, but for all Black people throughout the world. And so I think that my work as a Black physician has always been inherently political to me, but in terms of not a political party, but a politics of love and imagining a better future. And I think writing is a way to really engage people and remind people how that's possible. So I think back to those years, and I'm just really grateful I had that opportunity, because it's really set me up for all the experiences I've had in healthcare to be able to process those in a way that's really healthy and then connects me to other people.
And can you tell us about the piece you're going to read from tonight?
Sure. So this piece is from the Annals of Internal Medicine. It's called Bonds in Every Color. And as Danielle mentioned, I was a resident at NYU. So this is basically one of our meetings that we had for one of our diversity organizations. Let's see a passage from there. Each person entered the room with a hint of relief in their stride, their shoulders slightly more relaxed than before. They were mostly Black and brown physicians like me at different points in their careers. They came with stories of pain and resilience to share. It was the first meeting of its kind for the NYU Internal Medicine Residencies organization committed to diversity, the idea originating from a group of Black female residents in our program. The conversation focused on experiences of discrimination against trainees by patients. This day was about supporting each other and sharing and listening to the challenges of being a trainee of color in medicine. Memories of these moments floated throughout the room. A senior resident spoke first, discussing the time her patient requested a doctor of a different race. The patient refused to look her in the eyes as if she were not worthy of his gaze. She felt stripped of her humanity. One of the attendings then recalled how years ago an intoxicated patient with a life-threatening bleed called him a nigger during a rant in the intensive care unit. Critical illness seemed to bring ambiguity to the situation, with everyone hesitant to confront a patient shouting racist epithets who was on death's doorstep. The patient died hours later. Afterward, no group debriefing was held for the attending. He discussed the necessary tragic armor he had built around himself over the years because of experiences like these. The stories continued. The female intern whose patient commented on her body every morning, the male senior resident whose patient complained about the heaviness of his accent. Hearing these stories in succession was shocking. I felt compelled to share one of my own. On a regular clinic day, my first patient, a disheveled elderly man, limped into the room. His speech was pressured. He was quite earnest to prove he was fine despite the voices in his head he had struggled with for years. As I tried to focus our conversation, he fixated on the tragedy flashing on morning news channels. A gunman had opened fire on LGBTQ patrons of color at Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. At the time, it was the worst shooting in US history. Can you believe what happened? He asked repeatedly. I again tried to refocus him. Then he said, they deserved it. All those homosexuals and their sin. They have to be punished at some point. I was floored by the blatant hatred in his statement. I left the room as my composure disintegrated into a million pieces. As a member of the LGBTQ community, I identified with those who had lost their lives. I gathered myself before precepting with my attending. I thought about suppressing what just happened, filing it away with the collection of traumatic experiences and training I would never confront. However, something compelled me to speak about it. My attending listened patiently, validated my emotions. She allowed me to decide how to handle the situation, and she checked back in with me days later. She was a model ally. I finished that clinic visit, then rescheduled the patient with another provider, and I found closure. It was challenging to listen to my peers, realizing they often felt alone and that patients at times questioned their legitimacy because of a darker skin color, an immigrant accent, or different hair texture. The patient-provider relationship is not immune to racism, misogyny, or homophobia, a salient truth that felt deeply unjust. Our time together as physicians of color laid bare the ubiquity of trauma in our profession. Medicine's implicit curriculum taught us to suppress our feelings, to seem strong in the face of adversity, to put the patient first, to avoid being seen as difficult. Yet as we were vulnerable with each other, we drew strength from each other, and we created our own curriculum. We laughed, we held each other up, and we affirmed our stories in tender, compassionate ways. The joy of community emerged from painful experiences. We made time and space for healing and connection.
Thank you. That was just beautiful. Thank you so much, Ofole. Damon, I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, there's lots of good stuff there. Your point about seeing the attending and how, in this case, she's really supported you. So a lot of, in my experience, I see a lot of students and trainees, and they come to me, and those scenarios don't happen where they don't get that support, and it's such a missed opportunity. So hopefully we can sort of explore that and unpack that, because people always, well, what can I do, or what should we do? And so I think I'd love to sort of explore that more with you later. But I'm going to turn to Esther right now. It's great to see you again. We were on a panel back in 2019 at the Atlantic, and we were talking about some of these themes, and gosh, so much has happened since then. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about your writing journey, and what you've been working on, and have sort of tell us a little about how you've sort of gotten in this world. I remember for you starting with a tweet, but I wanted to sort of see kind of how it all kind of got going and where you are now.
Yeah, I think starting with a tweet is not a bad place for this discussion. And I think we're probably all on our individual journeys as a writer. But I will say last week, somebody asked me to write a profile for something. And I put the word writer, and then I erased it. And I realized I'm actually not comfortable. I don't know if you get a letter in the mail or something when it's like you can officially put that down, but I feel like I have not gotten it yet. And I write things, but I don't consider myself a writer. And I've read some of work from all of you, and I feel like when I read works by people that I consider writers, it seems like there is just a confidence and an authority that I see there that I don't feel or own yet, or maybe it's just knowing your voice. But I will say I've been writing a column for the Lancet for the past year, and I almost said no because I couldn't imagine generating a column every 4 to 6 weeks, because I'm not a writer. And somebody gave me a piece of advice that still makes me laugh, which is like, think of every essay as a whole bunch of 280 character tweets, Esther. And they're like, you seem to put those out in a large volume. So just make a whole long thread and then take away the Twitter part, and that's an essay. And that's kind of how I think of it. I'm like, I know I can write small chunks and I'll just keep going. And I still have to get into that space. But I have looked at writing enough to know that getting a New York Times bestselling book is like a moon landing, just in terms of everything that needs to come together. So when I see your successes, I really feel like it feels like I am so proud to see that. And it really feels like just something to celebrate. So I really, that's kind of, I think I'm probably still mid-journey, but I just really admire what you all do and hope to get there myself someday.
And is there anything you want to share with us? Or are you going to share with us?
I do. So it's my last Lancet column, otherwise known as, a bunch of tweets strung together. So this is called Easy and Tough Out, the Dam of Healthcare Racism. Until the 1980s, the practice of turning away patients on the basis of their ability to pay without evaluating or treating them was legal and frequent in US hospitals. A 1986 study at Cook County Hospital, a public hospital in Chicago, noted that 89% of patients transferred from private hospitals to their facility were Black and Hispanic, and 87% of them were transferred because they did not have adequate insurance. Mortality was disproportionately high among those transferred, likely due to delays in stabilization and definitive care. This practice was ultimately disrupted, although it still continues today, not by institutions recognizing its unethical nature and voluntarily halting it, but by the passage of the Federal Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, or EMTALA, which requires hospitals to stabilize and treat patients before transfer, irrespective of insurance status. In other words, it took a literal act of Congress to change this fundamentally racist and inequitable practice. I thought about this history recently because of a conversation with a colleague about hospital equipment that retains components labeled master and slave. Why not remove those names, I asked. It's written into the manuals and the systems and the technology, he told me. Removing those terms everywhere would take an act of Congress. Elements within medicine that reinforce racism, for example, racist clinical calculators, patient transfer practices, equipment design, poor representativeness of clinical trials, are put into everyday practice easily, frequently, with surprisingly little challenge, barriers, or argument. The dismantling of racism in medicine, by contrast, is laborious, gradual, and painstaking, often done against great resistance. This easy-in, tough-out system of inequity is like a dam. It is by nature designed for accumulation, for retention of racism. When healthcare organizations establish new policies, programs, and decision-making processes with an equity lens, these gradual inflow improvements cannot change what is happening in total when there hasn't been any corresponding removal of already accumulated policies, programs, and processes that reinforce racism. This phenomenon also applies to the care individual patients receive. Physician scientist Tamora Lewis has described cumulative deprioritization in healthcare settings. As healthcare professionals make constant decisions about allocating limited resources of supply, time, and attention, implicit bias and deep subconscious beliefs about who matters and who is more valuable or dispensable creep in. The many small delays or relative disadvantages in the delivery of care compound and lead to inequitable outcomes by race. And yet this gradual accumulation can go unseen by healthcare providers at a macro level. Thus, in patient care, I would argue, the easy-in harms Lewis describes are matched with a tough-out system of corrections. If we recognize the disparities in patients' outcomes on the basis of race and ethnicity, and as we begin to understand the mechanistic, logistical, and structural underpinnings, what actions are needed to prevent or course correct in real time at the bedside? In other words, what are the release valves for racism? Medicine recently lost a physician in a scenario that prompts reflection on such questions. Susan Moore was a Black woman and a physician who contracted COVID-19 in November of 2020. During her initial hospitalization, she posted online, voicing her concerns about facing racial discrimination. She described how pain medication was withheld and how her symptoms were dismissed, leaving her feeling that she had to beg for appropriate treatment. I put forth and I maintain if I was white, Moore said in a video, I wouldn't have to go through that. Shortly after her discharge, she presented to another hospital, febrile and hypotensive. She was intubated within days and died on December 20th, 2020. When inequities in care begin to accumulate before our very eyes, what effective countermeasures are needed to dismantle them in the moment? In the aftermath of Moore's tragic death, will medicine begin to identify and use such measures? There is no question that in both health systems and the daily actions of clinicians, we remain far less facile and assured in removing racism than we are in incorporating it. And until that imbalance changes, our statements and aspirations about being anti-racist cannot connect meaningfully to progress.
Wow, Esther, thank you. That was really quite something. And I think you point to the issue of inertia. And one thing in medicine, I think it's different from other fields, is that our training period, those 3 to 5 years of, internship and residency, they frame who we are. In a way, this doesn't happen with accountants, I think, or lawyers in the same way. But so whatever era people have trained in, the way things are, that's the way things are. And so when you talk about how clinicians don't even see some of these biases, it's because it's sort of baked into how you became a physician. And taking them apart actually means taking apart some of who you are. And so I think a lot of the resistance comes to the fact that it's just too threatening to our definition of who we are as physicians as we try to change things, even with acts of Congress. Thank you for that. I'm going to introduce Kevin Gutierrez, who is going to tell us a little bit about how he came to this. Can you talk about how you started writing in the narrative medicine program?
Sure. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I've seen everyone's writing here and feel very fortunate to be surrounded by you all and share our work. And there's been so many threads that have really connected, I think, across our kind of mutual narratives. My story kind of started in college. I studied Spanish literature and was very much into narrative theory and philosophy, and then came across the narrative medicine program at Columbia. And was very influenced there by a lot of the thinkers and scholars there to think deeply about writing from the margins was kind of a term we like to use, and where you have dominant narratives and you have counter narratives, and how frequently in terms of how we're taught certain things by institutions that there is a dominant narrative and that there are counter narratives or quieter, more silent or kind of subjugated narratives. And I think that from learning from decolonial theory, critical race theory, these were all theories that kind of arose in bodies of literature and canons that were, by their definition, silenced and considered peripheral. And I think that learning that from a more theoretical standpoint, I was kind of predisposed to always take writing in a direction that reads against rather than with. And so I think, as we had discussed here, as medical training progressed, I was continually told I don't have a voice, and in particular when we see so much violence against folks of color, and in particular Black folk in this current political milieu, which is just another kind of iteration of American history. And so I continued to write, and found that writing was important to, because I felt a responsibility to kind of, as Dr. Harper had mentioned, to work individually with patients, but also to resist and reimagine the kind of larger policies that affect them too, that they may not see in the one-on-one clinic environment. And so I was hoping to read from a piece I was fortunate to publish recently in the New England Journal, called the Performance of Anti-Racism Curricula. And so I'll just begin here. So consider an institution that says it's committed to anti-racism and has added mandatory anti-racism training, broadcasting that we're paying attention to this topic. Yet it has no Black or Latinx senior faculty, supports no research dedicated to studying racism specifically, has poor retention rates of Black and Latinx clinicians, has a history of retaliating against employees or clinicians who speak up, and presents no plan for addressing these issues, or has excluded its own members of color from participating in the planning. What does a new anti-racism curriculum do, set against the backdrop of these structurally racist practices? It directs attention away from their very examination. Until anti-racism is seen not merely as new information to learn, but as a continual practice of unlearning, it joins a long list of actions that have only delayed examination of institutions themselves.
Thank you, Kevin. And actually, that's a great starting point, I think, for the discussion, because we want to talk about how writing does or does not confront racism. I think the idea of the curriculum, the mission statements, the diversity statements, they are in abundance. You can't even go to the coffee machine without having a diversity statement. And then at some point you wonder, maybe Michele, you can talk about this a little bit. What happens with these words when they're used in so freely in abundance? What happens to their meaning? And is there a way to make the meaning really count?
Nothing really happens, because they don't mean anything, and they're just a cover and an excuse. And that's what ends up happening, that they end up being used in a performative way so that no substantive change has to happen. And so here we are. And this is why I found that often for me in these institutions, there is work I can do in the moment with the patient. But that's why I've tried to enact change from the outside. So by writing outside of the institutions, because I will say that this is really important. If you're going to have statements like that, but when I walk down the hallway of leadership in the hospital, leadership over time to the present moment, and we all have these hallways, and most of the hallways are different variations of old or older white men who do their gender in a way that is thought to be traditionally male, acceptable in that fashion. That is not representative anywhere in the country. I mean, at least no matter where you go, half the country is female or doesn't do their gender in that way. And most times where I work, it's generally inner city, predominantly Black and brown and immigrant, or just low income. And when I am often the only Black physician working in the ER, this is not representative. So the diversity statements, the commitment to equity, they are meaningless and insulting. So I feel that in having these discussions, it's my hope that we will be able to affect change from the outside at a grassroots level, because I have found often that is what it takes to make change happen.
So I'm going to actually, a question from one of our audience members, from Maria. She said, the words sound pretty and morally appropriate. This is, in my opinion, why they are used. How can we change pretty talk into action and shifts in institutional policy? And I guess one of my follow-up question to that is, I wonder if the reason there's no movement is that movement requires someone else giving something up. And of course, people who currently have power don't want to give it up, don't voluntarily. How do we turn that talk into action and open it up to anyone who wants to join in?
I'll say something.
Yes, go ahead, Michele.
That patients deserve better than that, and we as providers also deserve better than that. It's an instance of unearned privilege. It's baked into the cake that certain people will be recognized, heard, promoted, and cared for. And so if we say, well, that's not true, and actually we all deserve to be treated well as patients or as providers, then we're gonna have to just do that. I mean, it actually is quite simple in that way, but we have to hold institutions accountable, like the community does, and healthcare providers have to be willing to speak up. I know, look, we're all like speaking with the choir right here. We all agree with this, but it's going to take more than just us. And I think partnering with other community organizers, activists to do this work, because you're right. If we just try and do the work within the institution, I don't think we have enough numbers in that way. It's going to take community engagement, but that's for any kind of social progress. It's always the case.
Yeah, actually, Esther, you wrote in your previous Lancet piece something pretty hard-hitting. You said that goals should have specificity, timelines, and ownership. There should be endpoints, not processes. Language should be clear. The goal is to address racism, not merely culture or respect. And I wonder if you could maybe expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I spent, like the rest of you, I spent the whole summer reading these beautiful statements. They were so well written. It almost felt like a PR professional and somebody from the legal and compliance department got together and spent a lot of time writing them, you know? And I was looking for something specific, you know, not intent, something beyond intent. And that was very rare, actually. And I think part of it is that if you are talking about what you're going to change, you have to know where you are. And we don't really measure where we are or talk about it or frame it up in a way that shows that we understand the ways in which we need to change to get where we want to be, and we haven't articulated where we want to be. I mean, what does success look like? How do you know that you're there? When we're talking about clinical topics, we have so many words that capture those things that have all these abbreviations and everybody understands. I mean, when when we have goals in clinic for patients, hemoglobin A1C, or when Michele and I have to get a potential stroke patient to the CT scanner in 20 minutes, and if you're 1 minute late, I know that I will get a very explicit email showing in red how I failed to meet all the quality metrics for care of a stroke patient. And then we talk about something like racism, and there are no specifics. There's no, line by line markers, defined targets for success with numbers attached and something red lit up because we didn't meet it. So who is accountable for the absence of targets? Who's accountable for getting us there? What happens if we don't meet those targets that we haven't defined? All those things are, these are processes that we know to do for other things, but not for this thing.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask Kevin a question. So, because I'm thinking, in your article, you talk about the performance of anti-racism. So it makes me think about how a lot of medical schools these days have first and second year curriculum, preclinical, where they're talking about anti-racism topics. They learn about all what we call the social determinants of health and all those sorts of components. What I often find, though, is that when they get to the clinical world, a lot of that just kind of gets undermined. And so, but on some level, though, looking back from my experience, when I was a medical student, we had like 1 little hour of talk about race, 4 years, 1 little hour. And it was, okay, everything you want to talk about race, you can do it in this 1 hour, and that's it. No more. So in some ways, it looks like progress on the outside. You see, well, there's a whole course that we have talking about these issues, but there's also limitations as you explore. So I'm wondering what you think of that. Like, how do you take stock of the sense that maybe there's progress, but then maybe there's not, or maybe there's a lot more that needs to be done? Like, what do you see in that realm?
Well, unfortunately, it hasn't changed much in training. It's still upwards of an hour that is represented. And I think it's similar to kind of how folks of color, and in particular Black trainees, are kind of used as solutions in themselves. Is that, there's someone here, there's a curriculum here now, and things are done, it's gone. And a lot of ways that's a violence on both the kind of knowledge we're presenting, from, other bodies of literature, Black scholars and the lineage that they've created, and also to those trainees who are in that space. I found the same instance. You learn, we can reference every trial about, Vital and all the different trials about different medications that raise correction factors. And then when you get into the clinical setting, it comes down to your attending. It comes down to ultimately power. And I found that in my experience being an educator, that if just representing these different topics is certainly not enough. And I think a lot of times it's designed not to be enough. And I think that what ultimately needs to change is the differential in power, and specifically with regards to whose voices are heard, who gets to speak up, empowering trainees to have a voice and feel like they have access to lay claim to what is the case or what should be the case within our medical system. And I at least found in my experience that, and I'm sure everyone here, when they were a trainee, felt the same way, is you're told that you have things to learn, and you have nothing to contribute. When we're talking about the immediacy of violence in along the axis of race, I think that we do have a lot to offer. And that is something that fundamentally I find that the medical institutions have not been able to grapple with. So until really power is really redistributed in a way that probably would not look so appealing to most people, I find that most of our solutions through the form of like curricula will, inevitably fail.
Well, there's a number of questions from the audience, and I'll share some of them. One person writes, as a trainee, this is a medical trainee, this is Kate, I sometimes feel like I and my peers don't really have a voice on political matters. How does a medical hierarchy fit into this discussion about confronting racism? I don't know, or Ofole, if you want to take that question, or Michele, if you face that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think folks have alluded to the fact that the medical system we've inherited is one that we all understand is rooted in structural violence, right? It's thinking about anatomy labs being done on the bodies of slaves. It's thinking about, you know, the uteruses of Black women being taken against their will. It's research being done on Black boys without their parents' consent. That's the system we're inheriting. And so I agree that, you know, we need different approaches, right, to how we kind of think about racism and tackling racism within a hierarchy. And I think Esther kind of talked about this, right, that there's ways that we can talk the language in terms of what are the metrics, what are the outcomes, right? Think about allies in positions of authority and power when you're a younger trainee, you know, latch onto them as mentors, form communities that kind of push out new ideas. You know, people have been doing that for a long time, and I think it's important for young trainees to know that that's what they should be doing to survive, right? Find like-minded people. But I think, you know, one thing that's important to recognize is with, you know, being in this COVID-19 pandemic, we just passed 500,000 lives lost. Many of them Black people, many of them young Black people of promise. And so this is about reimagining this whole kind of really tarred system that we've inherited. And, you know, part of racism is blinding us to the reality that what we've inherited is essentially rotten, right? And there's really not a lot of ways that we can just make it better, you know, and kind of tinker. We have to completely reimagine how these things are, you know, how we deliver healthcare and how we interface with patients and what how our systems interact with communities where they're located.
Yeah, good.
Yes, that's a really good point. I just want to ask, can I ask another question now, Danielle?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you know, thinking back, so all of us have written in a sort of more a broad way, you know, different forms. But I like to always tell people that all physicians, all medical providers are in some ways authors. They're writers. You know, that you're taking a story. A person comes to you, they have symptoms, they have their own story, and we sort of transcribe that. And there's so many ways which that can go wrong. And there's people writing about the bias in the medical record and how that gets propagated and becomes its own sort of problem. I'd like to ask you guys. So on this, what do you guys think about? What do you all think about the idea of sort of the narratives of age, race, gender? I get that question all the time. You know, the use of race in that sort of format. That people are rethinking that. People are protesting that, contesting it. So think about things that we can do within our canon. I'd love to hear people's thoughts about it. I get that question all the time. Like, what do you think about race being up there? That age, like 27-year-old Black woman, 30-year-old Asian female. You know, what do you guys make of all that? And what do you think we should do with that?
Can I just say something really quickly, just because
Sure.
I don't want to let the medical community off the hook on this one.
Oh no.
We
I don't want you to.
We need more data, certainly, on inequities. We also have a lot of data. It is well established. Study after study, decade after decade, data on when it comes to patients. Inequitable distribution of invasive procedures like cardiac catheterizations, which we know are life-saving in many instances, being given to differentially to people who are white or higher income or male. I mean, the list goes on. We have data about that. We have data about higher morbidity and mortality because certain patients are declined evaluation and treatment, not being given pain medicine for long bone fractures that we know are painful. And the only difference between the two patient groups in this particular study is their race. And even when the provider is asked, they've said in some of these studies, well, Black people don't feel pain the same way, so we don't need to treat it. I mean, we have so much data. We have data about inequity in pay for providers, doctors who are people of color, for women, lack of promotion for those. We have reams of data. So these are some instances where it's not because we don't have the information. It's because we don't want to do anything about it. And that's just facts on the ground. So what's the answer? The answer is pressure within to be courageous enough to say, no. We know enough to take steps now, and we can. And then again, partnering with people, because we don't have enough numbers, but doing our work within and without, because we know enough to make it better now.
Well, someone, Lucy in our audience asked, she mentioned that nearly every institution now has a dean for diversity. So now there's someone in a position of power in the dean's office with this title. Yet, she says, I don't think they have solved much. They have done much. So what does it mean, Michele, or anyone, that we have someone officially in every single medical school and hospital whose title is to work on that? And yet, why haven't we moved?
Well, they can't act alone. I mean, they can't just be a figurehead and not be support. I mean, even the best human being who actually cares, I mean, not all of them do, okay? But even if they do, if the whole system is against them, it's just not possible.
Right.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, unfortunately, deans of diversity oftentimes can be trotted out when there's a problem that bubbles up that's related to racism, whether it's on the medical student level or the residency level or anywhere in the institution, and they kind of put this person forward as a peacemaker. And I think that so much about how medical schools and institutions work are about structural gaslighting, right? It's about all these horrible racist things kind of going on within the structure, and then us saying, oh, no, that's not racist, right? Trotting out a Black person in that position when things go wrong is not the way to do it. So I think deans of diversity can make a real difference when it's not about, okay, let's get people of different colors and backgrounds into the same space, but it's about how do we reimagine what we're doing? How do we undo some of the structure that's been put in place of damaging our trainees and our patients? And I think throughout my training, I've never heard those positions kind of couched in that way. But I think if they are couched in that way, there's opportunities for real change. And so we'll see kind of as the conversation has shifted and all these statements have come out, what happens to people in these deans of diversity positions.
I wonder if anyone would comment about the role of money, because I think when you peel back a lot of the issues in healthcare and medicine, as in politics, it really does come down to money. I mean, look at the nonprofit hospitals that, rake in quite the profit. And maybe Esther, in your research, have you seen where the financial part crosses the racial part?
I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but I mean, certainly, I mean, there are like the big things, it's like who has power, who's advanced, who has voice, who has money. I mean, those things are all distributed inequitably. But did you mean
because where is the money to be made? I mean, hospitals are businesses very often, and their services will be geared toward what earns money. Not necessarily for vicious reasons, but it's not an accident that the way we deliver services is related a lot to how the income flows. And I mean, you have to keep the lights on, that is true, but there is money to be made in healthcare. And I think that often determines how things get structured. Do you see a connection there?
Yeah, for sure. In a lot of ways. I mean, one thing is, a lot of people pushing for institutions to do things in a different way, bring out this data that's been amassed by McKinsey and other, big corporate firms, looking at what happens when you compare like institutions, but one has more diversity in its leadership, in its board, in its workforce, And it turns out when you see greater representativeness, almost always that's a more successful company in every metric that matters, in how connected you are to your customers and how productive your workforce is and how much workforce retention you have in actually your financial bottom line, So companies in the top quartile of diversity tend to perform in the top, in the top whatever quartile in terms of financial returns, and companies that have very poor diversity tend to be much lower. And so, that is an argument to companies about being better in that way. You can say, well, what matters to you ultimately? And frankly, it's about money on some level. And you can say, well, even for your bottom line, it is better to have greater representativeness. However, I mean, I guess it's just what everybody's been saying. It's like secondary prevention is always harder than primary prevention. It's like I feel like we're always trying to take this thing that we inherited, and retrofit it to something that works better. But there is just so much that's embedded that plays out in ways and deep inequities that it's like, you can do the check boxes, you can sprinkle a lot on top of that, but you fundamentally have the same system. And so I do see a lot of companies trying to be like, well, I want to capitalize on that increased return. So I'm going to sprinkle a little, difference throughout our leadership board and our workforce and put in some mentorship programs, and are we good? And so, as I read the comments and I hear the conversation, I really, at some point, we have to build better from the ground up. I think as new organizations are really reimagining what healthcare should look like, it is just so hard to retrofit the kind of goals we're talking about into systems and structures that have been in place for hundreds of years, that had kind of a singular goal, which is to design a structure that keep people in power in that power.
Actually, Yolanda from our audience asked, have there been successful anti-racism programs where metrics and methods of evaluation have been put in place in medical schools or other institutions? Have any of you come across places you can point to as success stories?
Or even relative success stories. How about relative?
Well, by success, I'm unclear what the term success means. Success for patients, success for providers. I think that's the first question. I mean, for patients, there have been, I think, some interesting kind of quality improvement studies that have been done. I think there's something called the ACURE trial down in North Carolina, where they looked at trying to decrease disparities in early stage breast and lung cancer patients, decrease the Black-white disparity. And so they basically did, institutional racism training of their staff and employees and their providers. They had like early alert systems for those patients to make sure that they completed their treatment for early cancer. There's innovative kind of things that are being rolled out. But in terms of like on the institutional level, I think first, we don't agree on what success looks like, right? Because success to many people in positions of authority and power means exactly what we were just saying, right? Some more Black and brown faces in the room, right? Same kind of meetings where we, kind of center the same type of issues. We don't invest in the communities where the institutions are, and that's seen as success, right? So I think the first thing is kind of how do we radically redefine what success looks like, right? Like I think being an HIV provider, so much of the kind of national narrative is how well we've done with the HIV pandemic, but I see young Black and brown LGBTQ men and women coming into my office with new diagnoses all the time, struggling with substance use, struggling with mental illness, pushing back against a system that is literally just making their HIV/AIDS the number 9, 10, 11 thing on their list of things they have to worry about, right? That's not success. And so how do you balance, right, these real scientific advancements, these real kind of triumphs in HIV science, the idea that people can now live a healthy life being HIV positive, how do you balance that with the reality of what Black and brown people are facing, struggling to live their life day to day with HIV, right? How do we think about success in that healthcare paradigm?
Sure. Michele, maybe I'd ask you, what do you see as success?
This is perfect time. I was just wanting to jump in.
All right.
A couple things. I mean, certainly outcomes for patients or anyone seeking care. And, on the subject of studies, I've been reading some really interesting research just comparing similarly resourced countries. So looking at rich nations, it's not a surprise or a secret. We have some of, like the most expensive healthcare system and some of the worst outcomes. Just we don't meet it in terms of metrics. Our patients don't do better. They're not healthier. And this research group out of the UK plotted social inequity, typically financial, which, there's so many proxies with race and poverty and just different components of inequity that still plot out and match financial inequity. So they looked at inequity financially in a society and how that plotted against healthcare outcomes. And they showed time after time, the more unequal a society, the worse their health was. And not just for people who are poor, for people who are wealthy as well. So wealthy people in this country have more depression, anxiety, suicide, substance abuse. Like, this is not working well for us as a nation. What it works well and what it's designed very well to do is concentrating power in a certain group, whether or not they're healthier for it. That's what our system does. So reimagining it, to me, is a society where people have their basic needs met, like a living wage, access to free and at least affordable quality education. Everyone deserves healthcare. It should actually, we say it's a right, but it's really a privilege in practical terms in this nation. So if we have more equity in that respects, we will have better patient outcomes for whoever that is that's a patient. I will say there is this place, there is this ER. I haven't worked there, but I know people who do. That's an example of what seems to be more equitable and productive. And from what I've heard from speaking to people who work there in Director, it's not because they have some special diversity program, because that's never really going to be the answer. It's because it is their culture where they believe in equity. And so when they took me to their wall, it was for their wall for the hospital, like everyone in the hospital. I didn't even know I was going to their wall of leadership because I'd never seen something like this before. Like, so many different colors, ages. I had no idea what they wanted me to know about their gender. And the director said, this is what our wall looks like because this is what we believe in. And I will tell you, it's hard as heck to work in that ER because people don't leave. The staff likes it there. And the patients seem to like it. I don't know their exact outcomes, but there's a real sense of community that functions well. So I have gotten a glimpse of this place one time.
It makes me wonder if it's really not so much our medical system, but our society, that no matter how great we make this one ER, we still have our society. And do we all then just, all move to Denmark and find a place where there's, where those basic needs are met, and then maybe it's easier to achieve those outcomes?
No, we got to hold ourselves accountable. We got to do this work here. And that there enter courage and integrity. This is our work to do, and it is possible.
So speaking of courage, there's a question here about taking risks with writing. And if any of you want to talk about moments where you've taken a risk or gotten pushback, and how do you balance your sort of career security? We all would like to stay employed with things you write, and how do we navigate that? Esther, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I think part of these conversations, and I will say too that I am an introvert and I am shy. And then there's just things that you need to speak up about, so I think probably all of us have, because of the topics we write on, I've had that moment where we're like, it's not optional. These things need to be said. So I think if you come to it like that, then some trouble comes with it. I certainly have caused my institution some pain. And I've had some requests that have really reflected that. So at one point, our security office, they called me, and it was such a nice request, the way they put it. They were just kind of like, can you warn us when you're about to write something, maybe calling out white people? Because, we support you, but we need to be ready for that kind of thing. And it made me actually appreciate how much, when you come from an institution, it's like I am comfortable actually with I mean, I have to say, I speak from I'm a full professor. I have NIH funding. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why I can be edgier and not fear for my job. So that is very different than being a trainee, being a per diem employee, being early in your career, or not faculty. So I, for me, it's like, I'm going to take these risks and I'll have some like kind of personal backlash, but it's different than worrying that I'll lose my job. But I will say I was acutely aware of the fact that when you represent an institution and you do some of these things, there's a lot of people actually who are impacted besides yourself. And I wanted to have compassion for those people. And then I think there's also, you have to think about your family too. So there was one time where, for whatever reason, something I wrote about racism got circulated to like a bad corner of the internet. And the threats were so explicit, we had to have a police detail around my house for a couple of weeks. And so and my husband, my much suffering husband, was kind of like, I want to be supportive of you, but just, let's just be conscious of how often, our children are mentioned and how often we have a police detail around our house. So I do think there is, and I really think I really get the least of it compared to many other peers who are speaking out for a lot of reasons. But I think there for sure is moments where you need to pause and think about, okay, I want to do this work, but how do I keep myself safe? How do I keep my family whole? And not afraid, and just like kind of put some pieces in place, and then move forward, just kind of knowing that the benefits kind of outweigh those things.
Thank you. There's two questions here about writing. Someone asked about that it's a certain act of resistance to publish the kind of writing people here are doing in these canonical journals, like taking up space in New England Journal of Medicine, the Annals, with that, but there's not a lot of accessibility, right? Most people aren't reading the Annals of Internal Medicine in their bathroom, other than people probably on this call. So thinking about writing in places that are more accessible. And someone else mentioned the idea of what kind of stories do you tell as opposed to analytical writing that will help advance this. And I'll add into that fiction. We often talk about fiction as the great lie that tells the truth. And then I'll also add poetry. I have back here a couple issues of the Bellevue Literary Review, and we publish a lot of fiction and poetry because sometimes it's easier to make a point and an impact when you're not sort of saying A, B, C, but in a way of telling the story. So if any of you want to comment on the many ways of writing and what stories or poems or other places to publish you find are effective. And actually, I may actually direct this first to Damon. I'm going to pull you up if you don't mind. Only because when I looked back at your book, I couldn't believe it was only 2015. I really thought it was like a generation ago. In my mind, like so much has happened in 5 years.
Yes.
As you start to tell this story, maybe you can kind of talk about the sort of storytelling aspect of this kind of writing.
Yeah, actually, I started with the medical journals. You were talking about Annals of Internal Medicine and JAMA. Those are the first sort of ones, and then a couple local newspapers as well. And then, as Michele mentioned at the beginning, you get this sort of you reach people all over the place, and with those journals, people in Australia and UK were responding to me. So you could just sort of realize that there was this bigger potential audience for it. I've been just thinking about what Esther was saying though, because at the time I was very junior in the process, and there was a lot of worry on my end of what it would happen, because at my institution there had been people who had spoken out and been shut down, and it was very real, and so I was worries about that. So I think in some ways that sort of framed my writing and made it more probably I was more careful in the way that it may not have been if I'm writing it now, because I'm in a different place. But it's just sort of balancing that and thinking about how people respond to you. But as far as writing in this larger way to the public, I don't know. It's funny because as a writer, this is even being on this panel is cool because you're so isolated in some ways. Writing is you're in your own little world, your own little bubble, your own little space. Sort of to share it with you guys has been really awesome. Because sometimes it's partly when I was writing, I didn't even necessarily realize how much it would reach people. and it was amazing. It was in different ways that would connect with people. So it's been humbling, and it's just been awesome to sort of see that, and to see how some people on the panel here have sort of expanded, taken what I sort of had done and have taken it in different directions, has also been really, really cool. I think that's a lot about writing, is just building on what's out there. And so when I was looking at what was there was the physician memoirs that I was looking at, there was very little of this. And so I was just trying to give voice to it in some small way. And other people have now been building on that. So that's sort of how I see it as being part of this larger kind of journey or story. And so, that's what I thought that.
And Kevin, I actually want to ask you, you had a piece in Medical Humanities a couple of years ago with Sayantini Dasgupta, a wonderful writer. Yeah. And you talked about the idea of writing from the margin, both from the perspective of medical humanities, but also for anti-racism. Can you talk a little bit, especially as being a trainee, you can't get much more marginal than being an intern or a medical student in the totem pole of things, and maybe talk a little bit about writing from the margin.
Yeah, I think that question goes a lot to what was asked too about fear and retaliation. I think that I too have had a fair share of retaliation, and I think that that has been rather ubiquitous. And I think that what was important to me was I felt compelled to write I pictured students sitting in those large lecture halls, those long hallways that Dr. Harper had described, and feeling alone, and feeling like there wasn't anything in the literature, there wasn't anything around me, I wasn't hearing any voices that were similar, and found that that even though I felt fearful for what could happen, I still felt that the story needed to be told. And sometimes that requires it be put in a language that's more academic, more analytical, which I think is makes certain spaces like journals more accessible, but it's also a violence on the kind of rawness of the experience itself. I think for a lot of, experiences of racism, there's a lot of expectations about what's considered an appropriate way to express, what could otherwise be rage and expletives. And I think that sometimes it's a balance between finding the right words that speak to that experience, but also finding some accessibility in other arenas. But that's for every individual to kind of decide. But I would hope that for trainees out there, that they know that unfortunately the fear doesn't go away. But I think that I think all of us were fearful when we were writing, and still continue to feel that way. And but you do find a sense of community with that, and it feels very humbling. And I feel warm inside hearing that other people have felt the same thing, and it didn't really manifest until I kind of stuck my head out there.
Thank you. And we're coming on the hour. So I want to sort of close with a round robin here. A question from Maria about which writers do we all look to for inspiration? And Ofole, I'm going to put you on the spot to start. Maybe you can mention other writers or books or people that kind of keep you going.
Oh, James Baldwin is my muse. He's always a fountain of inspiration, and I think for he's such an American hero. And I think even within medicine, whenever I read his work, I can see how it applies to my day to day, to my relationship with my patients, to how I view my work as service, my work in terms of how he kind of frames American history and kind of the long struggle of it, and his place within that story. So I continually go back to him, and I think this goes to representation, right? He was one of the first people whose voice that I heard, whose words I read, that really resonated with me, where I was just like, oh, I feel myself in the stories that he's telling, and the love that he's describing, and how he sees the world. And so, I think often it's not necessarily just medical writers or voices that I go to, it's often people outside of that. And he's one of those people.
Thank you. Michele, any writers and books you want to share with us, poets?
So I tend to just enjoy reading nonfiction and essays. So I will always say, top of mind, James Baldwin also, and Audre Lorde, and Toni Morrison. I love them, and I love their courage, power, and integrity. And I will say that I really do appreciate it. It's important to have a healthy respect for this work, because I do not take for granted my safety at all. I don't. That being said, so I pick my battles and try to make healthy decisions for me. And it also doesn't matter, as Audre Lorde would say, whether or not I am afraid. I need to do this work anyway and move through the fear.
Thank you. And actually, one of our audience members, Lisa, did offer an Audre Lorde quote earlier on saying, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And so talking about how, all of us in the house have a role in that. Thank you so much. Esther, do you want to share with us some of your inspirational writers or books?
Yeah, I think of writing a little bit like I think of a research project, which is like everyone's like, can we do the IRB? And you're like, first spend 80% of the time you're going to put to this research project reading. That's where all the time goes. And then you'll know what you want to write and exactly how it should be written. And I think I feel the same way about pretty much all writing. So I spend a lot of time reading people whose writing is so wonderful that all of a sudden writing seems inaccessible. But lately, a lot of time with Roxane Gay, who is just somehow just like the cleanest writer and so accessible. And she just kind of makes you feel like you're there with her and feeling what she's feeling. But there's just so much about her writing that is what I aspire to be. And then Tressie McMillan Cottom, who is a MacArthur Genius Award grantee this year, is someone who clearly was born to write, and just like the volume and the smartness of everything she puts out there and the way that she articulates really, really complicated things in these short, powerful essays is just something I always feel like it's an explosion that she creates in the brain. But those are two women I'm spending a lot of time with these days.
Thank you so much. Kevin, who have you been reading?
I eternally return to Bell Hooks. I think that she's defiantly accessible. She writes for there's no population she cannot write for. And I think that that's truly the range and depth of her work is just continually rejuvenating and validating to read. So I truly enjoy her work.
Thanks. Damon, any writers you want to share with us?
Oh gosh, I'm embarrassed to say I don't have to. You guys have mentioned a lot of people already. It's the danger of going towards the end. So yeah, you stole my thunder. But I just enjoy reading. I mean, any good writer, as you mentioned, Esther, is just about reading 80% is reading other people's work and taking from that is such an important piece to those of you out there who want to be writers. There's so much reading and taking. So I take something from a lot of different folks, including the folks on this panel. I'm just going to put that out there. I really enjoyed all of your writing as well. So.
Thanks. And I'll say for me, I find that I spend so much of my day in, realistic type writing within the medical chart and most of my sort of more journalistic writing that when I want to read, I want to go to Gabriel Garcia Marquez and go to the magical realism and get so out of the logic but it's so logical. It's logical in the way that our brains and souls and minds work. So, and then I really enjoy, reading the poetry in the BLR. So I'll demonstrate here. Having a chance to read different, because a poem, takes this little tiny strand of emotion and pulls it out there, and no prosaic details of, plot and character. That's all up to you, but you get to take out that little bit and sort of make it bare and put it right out there and just gets you in the gut. And so I want to thank everyone on the panel. Michele Harper, Ofole Mgbako, Kevin Gutierrez, Esther Choo, and my co-editor, Damon Tweedy. It's really been a pleasure to hear you guys. We've posted everyone's work in the chat, and we'll send it out. I want to give a moment to thank the Gold Foundation, who does such pioneering work in medical humanism. And we'll post the Gold Foundation website as well, who's helped make this panel come to be. And if you haven't read BLR, Bellevue Literary Review, I encourage you to check it out. If you RSVP'd for the event, you'll get a buy one, get one free coupon for a BLR subscription to read what other people are writing in sort of all aspects of life and how illness and health and healing intersect with our lives. And so thank you all for a wonderful evening. We'll post this on our website. Have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.